The order came through a crackling radio in the final seconds before the line went dead entirely. Hold position, buy time, do not expect extraction. 22 men heard those words and understood in the same terrible instant exactly what they meant. They weren't a defensive line anymore. They were bait, sacrificed on paper before a single shot had even been fired, abandoned by the same command that had sent them here 3 days earlier, promising reinforcement, promising support, promising they would never be left alone against an enemy advance this size. Now the radio was silent. The retreat was already underway behind them, and 22 men stood in a shattered trench line, staring at each other in the dying light, slowly realizing that the war had just written them off, and none of them were ready to accept that yet.
Sergeant Ramon Aguilar read the order twice before letting the radio slip into the mud, his knuckles white, his jaw locked so tight it ached. He had fought alongside most of these men for 8 straight months, knew their families, their fears, the small private things soldiers only tell each other in the hours before dawn when sleep won't come. And now the same command structure that had asked everything of them was pulling back an entire division and leaving this position and the men holding it to be swallowed whole by an advancing enemy force nobody expected to survive contact with. Aguilar looked out at his men, watched the news settle over each of their faces in turn, and understood that whatever happened in the next 24 hours, it would define every one of them for the rest of their lives, however long that turned out to be.
Private Isco Marasigan was the first to break the stunned silence, his voice cracking with something between disbelief and fury. 8 months, he said. 8 months of promises that they'd never be left exposed, that command had their backs, that this war was being fought together. And now, at the exact moment it mattered most, they'd been quietly, deliberately sacrificed to slow an enemy advance long enough for everyone else to escape. Nobody argued with him. Nobody could, because it was true. Somewhere behind them, trucks were already rolling south, carrying soldiers who would live to see next week, while 22 men stood in a crumbling trench with dwindling ammunition, watching the horizon for a threat that intelligence estimated at well over 1,000 strong. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound most of them had taken in this war so far. Aguilar gave his men exactly 3 minutes to feel that anger before he needed it converted into something useful, because rage without direction would get every last one of them killed within the hour. He walked the length of the trench, meeting each man's eyes individually, and told them the only truth that mattered now. Command had left them to die, yes, but command didn't get to decide whether they actually would. If they were going to be written off as a delay tactic, they'd choose exactly how much delay they were willing to deliver, and on whose terms. Nobody in that trench had asked to become a legend or a sacrifice, but every one of them had a choice in the next few minutes about which one they were going to become instead, and Aguilar intended to make sure it wasn't the second option. The enemy's forward scouts appeared just before dusk, small silhouettes moving cautiously across open ground nearly a mile out, testing the position before committing the main force behind them. Marasigan watched through a cracked pair of binoculars and felt his stomach drop at what he counted. Not the 100 or so soldiers a defensible position like this might reasonably expect to face, but wave after wave stretching back toward the horizon. More men than 22 soldiers could hope to slow, let alone stop. He lowered the binoculars slowly, looked over at Aguilar, and didn't need to say the number out loud. Aguilar already knew. He'd known since the radio went dead. The only real question left standing between them and whatever came next was how they intended to spend whatever hours they actually had. Corporal Bayani Reyes, the trench's demolition specialist, had been quietly working a separate problem since the retreat order came through, and as darkness settled fully over the valley, he pulled Aguilar aside with something that looked almost like hope in his exhausted eyes. There was a supply depot roughly 600 meters behind the enemy's advancing line, poorly guarded because nobody expected any threat to still exist on this side of the front. If they could reach it, if they could destroy the fuel and ammunition stockpiled there before the main assault began, the enemy's advance wouldn't just slow, it might collapse entirely under its own logistics, buying far more time than 22 rifles holding a trench ever could. It was reckless. It was nearly suicidal. It was also, suddenly, the only plan that gave any of them a reason to move, instead of simply wait to die. Aguilar split the group without hesitation once Reyes laid out the plan. 12 men would remain in the trench, maintaining the illusion of a full defensive line for as long as humanly possible, while Reyes led a team of 10 toward the depot under cover of darkness. It meant splitting an already impossibly outnumbered force even further, accepting that the 12 left behind would face the brunt of whatever assault came first, buying time with their bodies, while the other 10 attempted something that could end the entire battle before it truly began. Private Marasigan volunteered for the depot team before Aguilar had even finished explaining the risks, driven by something that had shifted inside him since the betrayal. Not fear anymore, but a furious, focused determination to make Command's decision to abandon them cost the enemy everything it possibly could. They moved out just after midnight. 10 men crawling through mud and low grass with explosives strapped tight against their chests, every sound in the darkness sending fresh adrenaline tearing through already exhausted bodies. Reyes led from the front, reading terrain by memory and instinct rather than any map, navigating around enemy patrols with the kind of practiced silent caution that came from months of learning exactly how loudly a single mistake could get a man killed. Behind him, Marasigan kept glancing back toward the trench line they'd left behind, toward 12 friends who were at this very moment watching an army prepare to descend on their position, and felt the weight of exactly how much depended on what the next hour accomplished settle heavier across his shoulders with every meter closer they crawled toward the depot's perimeter fence. Back at the trench, the 12 men left behind watched the enemy's main force finally begin its advance under the pale gray light just before dawn. An overwhelming wall of soldiers and vehicles rolling forward with the calm, methodical confidence of an army that had already decided this engagement was a formality. Aguilar walked the trench one final time, checking each man's position, offering what steadiness he could through nothing more than his own calm presence and a voice that refused to shake even as the ground beneath their boots began to tremble with the approach of something none of them could realistically stop. He thought, briefly, about the families each of these men had written letters to just days earlier. Letters that suddenly felt less like routine correspondence and more like the last words some of them might ever send home.
The first artillery round struck the trench line at dawn exactly, throwing dirt and debris skyward in violent concussive bursts that rattled teeth and collapsed sections of hastily dug fortification along the eastern flank. Private Domingo Cruz, barely 20 years old, took shrapnel across his leg in the opening barrage and simply gritted his teeth, wrapped the wound tight enough to slow the bleeding, and returned to his position without a word of complaint. because somewhere out beyond the smoke and chaos, 10 of his brothers were attempting something that might make every second of this defense actually mean something, and he refused to be the reason it didn't matter. 12 men against an army that outnumbered them 50 to 1 held their line anyway, because behind them, everything now depended on borrowed time.
At the depot, Reyes and his team reached the perimeter fence just as the artillery barrage began echoing distantly behind them, a grim, urgent reminder that their 12 brothers were now under direct assault, while 10 men still had explosives to plant and a fence to cut through undetected. Marasigan worked the wire cutters with hands slick from sweat and mud, every snip of severed metal sounding to his adrenaline-flooded senses loud enough to wake the entire depot. Inside the fence line stood row after row of fuel drums and ammunition crates, guarded by a skeleton crew who clearly never expected a threat to materialize this far behind their own advancing force. Reyes signaled the team forward, and 10 men slipped through the gap in the fence, moving toward the single greatest act of sabotage any of them would ever attempt in their lives. They moved through the depot in practiced pairs, planting charges against fuel drums and ammunition stockpiles, with a speed born of pure desperation, every passing second carrying the growing risk of discovery, and the certain knowledge that back at the trench, 12 men were paying in blood for every additional minute this took. A guard rounded a corner unexpectedly, and one of the team neutralized him in near total silence before a single sound could escape. The same brutal, necessary calculus that war had forced onto all of them, again and again, until it had become simply another task standing between them and survival. Reyes checked his watch, checked the remaining charges, and gave the final signal. 10 men had roughly 90 seconds left to finish their work and disappear before the entire depot went up in a single devastating chain of explosions. Back at the trench, the 12 men were down to 8. The eastern flank had partially collapsed under sustained artillery fire, and Aguilar found himself questioning, in the rawest, most honest part of his mind, whether Reyes's team had even survived long enough to reach the depot at all. He'd lost radio contact with them nearly an hour earlier. There was no way to know if this defense, this brutal, costly, dwindling defense, was actually buying time for something real, or simply delaying an inevitable collapse for no purpose beyond a few more names added to a casualty list. He fired his rifle into the advancing line anyway, because stopping wasn't a real option left on the table, not with 8 men still beside him, who trusted him enough to keep holding a position everyone else had already abandoned.
The final charge went into place with less than a minute to spare, and Reyes's team broke into a full sprint away from the depot fence line, adrenaline overriding the exhaustion that had been building for hours of crawling, planting, and near discovery. Marasigan's lungs burned with every stride, his legs threatening to give out beneath him, but the image of 8, maybe fewer now, brothers still holding that trench line kept him moving faster than he thought his exhausted body still had left to give. Behind them, the timers on a dozen separate charges continued their silent countdown, ticking towards a detonation that would either save everything they'd sacrificed to reach this point, or accomplish nothing at all, if the timing had gone wrong in some way none of them could yet see. The depot detonated in a single, earth-shaking chain reaction that lit the entire horizon in a violent orange flash, visible for miles in every direction, fuel and ammunition igniting in sequence until the enemy's entire logistical stockpile for this advance ceased to exist in the span of roughly 11 seconds. At the trench line, Aguilar and his remaining 7 men felt the shockwave roll across the battlefield and watched, through smoke and disbelief, as the enemy's advancing formation staggered to a confused, uncertain halt. Officers screaming orders that no longer made tactical sense. Soldiers turning to stare back toward a fire consuming everything their offensive depended on. For one suspended, disbelieving moment, 7 exhausted men in a half-collapsed trench allowed themselves to hope that 10 of their brothers had actually, impossibly, succeeded. Without fuel, without resupplied ammunition, and without any clear understanding of what force had just struck them from behind their own lines, the enemy's advance didn't just slow. It began, unit by unit, to withdraw, officers redirecting their exhausted, confused soldiers away from a trench line that suddenly seemed far less important than the burning catastrophe consuming their entire supply chain. Aguilar watched the retreat begin with a disbelief that slowly, painfully, gave way to something he hadn't let himself feel in hours, the possibility that this might actually be survivable, that 7 men and whatever remained of Reyes's team might genuinely walk away from a position that had been written off as a sacrifice less than 24 hours earlier. He didn't allow himself to fully believe it yet, not until
Reyes's team stumbled back into what remained of the trench line just past midday, 9 men returning from a mission that had sent out 10, 1 lost during the depot assault, a loss that settled over the reunited group like a physical weight the moment they realized who was missing. There was no time for a proper accounting of grief, not yet, not with an enemy force still regrouping somewhere beyond the smoke-choked horizon, and uncertain whether this withdrawal was permanent or simply a pause before a renewed assault. But for one brief, exhausted moment, 16 surviving men from an original 22 stood together in a battered, half-collapsed trench that should have fallen hours earlier, and allowed themselves to feel something dangerously close to disbelief at simply, impossibly, still being alive.
Word of what had happened reached the retreating division's command post by evening, carried by a runner who'd nearly collapsed from the distance covered to deliver it. 22 men, abandoned as a delay tactic and written off as an acceptable loss, had not only held their position far longer than any reasonable estimate allowed, but had personally destroyed the enemy's forward supply depot and forced a full tactical withdrawal across the entire advancing front. The same commanders who had ordered the retreat, who had left these men behind with no expectation of survival, now found themselves reading a report that fundamentally altered the entire battle's outcome, because 16 soldiers had refused to accept the role they'd been assigned, and had instead written an entirely different ending than the one command had already prepared to mourn.
Aguilar never received a formal apology for the order that had left his men behind, and he never particularly expected one. Command decisions in war rarely came wrapped in accountability, and he'd long since stopped believing they might. What he received instead, in the weeks that followed, was something he valued far more: 16 names added to unit citations, and a quiet, permanent understanding among every soldier who heard the story that this particular group of men had turned an act of abandonment into one of the most consequential single actions of the entire campaign. Marasigan carried the memory of the one man they'd lost at the depot for the rest of his service, a weight he never fully set down, but one he decided, somewhere in the smoke and chaos of that night, was worth the outcome it had purchased for everyone else.
They were left for dead, written off on paper before a single shot was fired, sacrificed quietly to buy time for soldiers who would never know most of their names. And instead of accepting the ending that had already been decided for them, 22 men rewrote it themselves, in fire and mud and desperate, hard-won courage, turning an act of betrayal into the single most decisive strike of the entire campaign. 16 of them walked away, 6 did not. But the line they held and the depot they destroyed in defiance of an order that had already given up on them changed the outcome of a battle that history would remember, even if it never fully remembered exactly how close it had come to being lost entirely, in the hours when 22 men decided abandonment wasn't the same thing as defeat.